Hi, I'm Donna Grimes, Assistant Director for African American Affairs at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I work in the Secretariat of Cultural Diversity in the Church, and I'm happy to share with you some reflections on the development of the Bishop's Pastoral Letter on against racism, Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love. The letter came about as we entered the 50th anniversary of various civil rights milestones, such as the Voting Rights Act, passage of the Voting Rights Act, passage of the Civil Rights Act, and sadly the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. For the bishops, it was the Charlottesville rally that signaled a need for them to speak and to take action. But around the country, concerns have been brewing for quite some time, in particularly the Black community. We could start with the beating of Rodney King, and the killing of Amadou Diallo, the murders of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and so many Black men. And not to forget Black women like Sandra Bland and Rakita Boyd, and children like Tamir Rice, and the many children whose precious lives are taken in drive-by shootings through violence in our cities. Yet few perpetrators were convicted and sentenced. Cases were dropped many times. Not guilty verdicts were rendered. Grieving families were not comforted. Now, athletes and entertainers have spoken and taken a knee to express their feelings. Meanwhile, mainstream America the response has been fairly anemic. From the bishops we heard, stay peaceful, pray, don't turn violence on the police, and all lives matter. From one sector we heard complaints about desecrating the flag, but not much about desecrating Black lives. The silence of our church leaders was maddening. Not to take anything away from individual bishops and clergy, particularly those who reacted to headline cases with personal statements of compassion and community action. But for the most part, they appeared reticent to speak boldly against clear displays of racism and white supremacy. Finally, they did speak, first by creating a task force for peace in our communities, and then they formed an ad hoc committee against racism and this pastoral letter. I believe the key contribution of this pastoral letter has been to offer a platform to open the door to dialogue and action, to encourage us to resume the hard work of dismantling racism, and to authorize engaging in difficult conversations about racism in the community and in our church. What we can do now is not change the channel. We should address racism together at times, but it's vital to work on racism within our own groups as well. The in-group conversations will differ for white people and people of color. For instance, white people could focus on white identity, what it means to be white in America and in the world, and learning true American history. We could all benefit from that. People of color could focus on examining how they internalize racialized messages, and could focus on pursuing empowerment strategies. The pastoral letter encourages self-reflection for everyone, without implying that everyone should reflect in the same way. I appreciate the various critiques I've read about the pastoral letter. Whatever shortcomings are exposed in the text of Open Wide Our Hearts, we should give credit where credit is due. First, despite advice to concentrate solely on the sexual abuse crisis during their November 2018 meeting, the bishops decided to keep the pastoral letter on their agenda. Then the bishops approved the pastoral letter with a nearly unanimous vote, only 2 noes and 1 abstention. Bottom line is this: what they said was, and I refer you to page 4, what is needed and what we are calling for is a genuine conversion of heart, a conversion that will compel change and the reform of our institutions and society. Conversion of heart that compels change and reforms our institutions and society, that's a heavy lift. But we can do it because we know we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. The bishops are correct about what is needed, but can we honestly expect them to spell out in detail how to make it happen? Frankly, developing a blueprint for transformation will require collaboration and a lot of thought, planning, new resources, and intentionality. As Dr. Shawnee Daniels Sykes of Mount Mary University pointed out in a recent blog post about the Pastoral Letter, it's only been 50 years since racial segregation was outlawed in this country, and there's still a lot of discomfort when black faces appear in so-called white spaces. This is a young country, and we have a long history of subjugating black people, other people of color, and poor white people. So the ball is in our court now. We could press our bishops to say more and do more to animate their conviction that racism is a life issue. Ask your bishop, what's the plan in the diocese for dismantling racism? How will dismantling racism be addressed in local seminaries, in Catholic schools, in parishes? How will this imperative against racism play out in local hiring and contracting practices? We could ask our pastors to preach on racism, especially institutional racism. Ask the pastor or parish council to create space for courageous conversations in the parish. Study the Pastoral Letter and other resources. I would suggest Father Brian Massengill's book, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, to understand how the Church has addressed racism in the past and how we could step up more. Or read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, to understand how mass incarceration in the current age is another form of segregation, is another form that has really, continued the history of enslavement and racial segregation in this country. The Pastoral Letter calls on all elements of the Church to take action, and that is to say, individuals, families, institutions, and organizations. There are actions we can all take to resist racism festering in our hearts, in our community, and in our church. Catholic colleges and universities, even pastoral institutes, have tremendous opportunities to study, reflect, and act, and most importantly, to form anti-racist actors who are our future lawyers, doctors, educators, policymakers, parents, clergy, business owners, etc. Where do we start? First, we can acknowledge that white supremacy is a tacit American value. It's right up there with freedom and democracy. Learn how racism rears its ugly head through stereotypes and unconscious bias. Understand how racist ideas infuse our thinking, public policies, and practices, not just long ago, but even today. We can face the reality of white fragility on the subject of race. Recognize what happens when race is mentioned in mixed groups and mixed group conversations. Some people deflect, change the channel, leave the room. It's very difficult, it's very uncomfortable, and it takes the development of skills to be able to do that. We can, thirdly, develop intercultural competence, acquire the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed to relate with others effectively. Find your voice on the subject of race. Take risks to cultivate genuine friendships across racial lines. USCCB staff are finding their way toward implementing the Pastoral Letter and assisting Catholic entities to do the same. Offices are being reminded of the bishop's stated commitment to engage in efforts to resist racism, to reconsider their approaches, to evaluate the resource materials they are creating, and their methods of advancing the Church's mission of evangelization through catechesis, youth ministry, priestly formation, and liturgy, for example. In some cases, this is as fundamental as waking up to the fact that there are other people in the room and that one size does not fit all. One action I'm especially excited about is working with Catholic schools to address how the history of Native Americans and African Americans is presented in the curriculum? How are these cultures reflected in social studies, literature, and religion classes? How are we describing those experiences? Another exciting action is the listening sessions that the ad hoc committee and staff are conducting in dioceses around the country. These sessions are giving the local bishops more insight into how racism is being manifested in their community, how people are affected, historical experiences of people, the pain that people are carrying about racism. A study guide to the Pastoral Letter is in development. And the USCCB website provides numerous resources such as K through 12 lesson plan suggestions, brief issue backgrounders, and parish aids, with more materials coming. Lastly, I'm encouraged by a number of trends. Just a couple of them I'll lift up. One is the creative expressions of young artist activists. I'm thinking of a spoken word collaborative like Split This Rock, by which a diverse group of teens use poetry and art to explore racism and other social justice issues. I'm thinking also of emerging young leaders who are community organizers who are finding their voice, raising their concerns about race and other issues, other social justice issues. And then thirdly, I'm reminded that the Catholic Campaign for Human Development has been going strong for 50 years. You can read stories of hope as CCHD funds racial and economic justice empowerment projects. And then in closing, I'll leave you with an inspiring message that a friend sent to my phone. A door is much smaller than a house. A lock is much smaller compared to the door. A key is the smallest of all, but a key can open the entire house. Thus, a small, thoughtful solution can solve major problems. Let's get started.